to GNWT's Budget Dialogue number 3. And thank you very much for joining us on what is a lovely summer evening and, as I understand, the start of exhibition hockey. Bonsoir à tous et tous et merci bien de nous rejoindre aujourd'hui. Si vous avez des questions en français, s'il vous plaît, écrivez-le sur le côté. On va faire notre minute pour te répondre en français. Today's discussion is an opportunity to talk about all the different kinds of balancing and trade-offs that have to take place in order to maintain government's fiscal responsibility while providing both the best possible programs and services and to address our ongoing needs for infrastructure. Often those infrastructure needs are required to provide the very programs and services that we are delivering, as well as promoting economic growth. This is also an opportunity to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on our fiscal situation. While the COVID-19 pandemic has severely disrupted the Northwest Territories economy, as with so many economies across Canada and the world, there are signs of recovery, and thanks to federal transfers and federal support during the last few months, the GNWT remains in reasonably good financial shape. We will be able to support an economic recovery, and we will also be able to support the priorities of the Legislative Assembly over the upcoming budgets. There are 3 parts to this presentation. The first one explains the interaction and relationship between the GNWT's 2 budgets, the operations budget and the capital budget. And it speaks to the challenge of finding sufficient funds to pay for our capital plan while maintaining the existing level of operations. The second section describes some options for our own source revenues and how to increase them. And last, we provide some information about the economy as a whole, including labor force data, employment data, and we will be looking for information and suggestions on where and how to spend public funds while supporting the growth of the future Northwest Territories economy. We'll take pauses along the way between sections where you can ask questions or make your comments. So first, operating and capital budgets. People have often spoke to me about the GNWT's budget as though it were a single thing, when in fact, the GNWT has 2 budgets, a capital budget and an operating budget. The capital budget deals with expenditures for capital, such as roads, bridges, or buildings. These are things that are more durable and have a long life. The capital budget is released in the fall of the previous fiscal year, so that departments can get their contracts and supplies ready in time for the start of the fiscal year on April 1st. This fall, for example, the Assembly will be reviewing the 2021-22 capital budget. The operating budget consists of the day-to-day spending for all the programs and services and includes the GNWT's revenues from all sources. This much larger operating budget is usually released in February, which gives GNWT departments 2 months to get ready for the start of the fiscal year. The operating budget surplus, which is the revenue that remains after all of our program expenditures, this is what helps fund the capital budget. The GNWT certainly can borrow and does borrow to invest in capital, but under the fiscal responsibility policy, at least half of the capital budget needs to be paid from surpluses that come from the operating budget. And so this is the rule you see at the bottom of the slide, that capital investment requires operating surpluses. So balancing our operating expenses with capital investment. You've likely heard it said that the Northwest Territories has an infrastructure gap compared to the national average. And this is both because we have less infrastructure in the territory and because that infrastructure that we have is older than elsewhere in the provinces. Cost sharing our programs with Canada means that small investments can have large returns, but the GNWT again needs operating surpluses in order to take advantage of those opportunities. If the federal government is offering us 75 cents on the dollar, our 25 cents stretches much further than it would without the federal help. This is a better deal than what most of the provinces get at a 50-50 rate, but it does require, again, that we contribute that 25%. And keep in mind that on a large project, 25% can be a significant amount of money. Some infrastructure is needed to deliver government programs and services, like schools to deliver education or health centers to deliver on health facilities and health programs. Other infrastructure will not only support residents, but can also support business growth and the economy at large, such as our transportation networks. The challenge is to manage our revenues and our spending on programs and services so that there remains sufficient resources, expenses and capital to address our capital needs. There are also trade-offs between the different types of infrastructure. For example, do we want to take a calculated risk to support a few large projects that could potentially deliver significant economic growth over a long term? Or do we want to stick to more smaller projects that may have stronger short-term impacts? A few words on the COVID-19 impacts. As I said earlier, COVID-19 certainly has caused our fiscal outlook to deteriorate, as is similar across the country. Compared to the projections that we have in Budget 2020, our revenue is down and our expenditures are up, which has reduced what was projected as our operating surplus. You can see in the chart here the projections that we had at the time of delivering the budget, which are in white, and the update that we are now projecting, which are in blue. And there have certainly been a significant decrease, particularly this year and next year. We are fortunate in the Northwest Territories that with the Territorial Formula Financing Grant from the federal government, it provides approximately 70% of our total revenues, and it offsets losses in our tax revenues. Over time, the revenue declines that we are seeing this year and next will in fact result in higher grants under the TIF in the following 4 years. As well, with respect to COVID, Canada has provided some additional funding that is helping us to cope with the added expenses. Despite the global pandemic resulting in the higher expenses and lower revenues, the Gnwt will still have more revenue than what it spends on programs and services. And so that is the operating surplus that will allow us to proceed to invest in much needed infrastructure under the capital plan. We do have only a little wiggle room though. And as we continue to increase our borrowing, if we were to increase our borrowing to fund our capital through debt, our current levels of borrowing simply would not be sustainable over the long term. If we were to keep it up, we would hit our borrowing limit increase, or even with the borrowing limit increase. The capital plan will require operating surpluses. So, if surpluses are not maintained or restored, our capital plan will need to be revised lower. The budget that we have is one that's prepared year over year, but the capital plan in fact looks at long-term infrastructure needs. The capital plan here is shown in the white bars, and you can see that it is much greater than the operating surplus amounts that are shown in the blue bars. As a result, these level of surpluses simply will not meet the fiscal responsibility policy guideline of being half of what is required for the planned capital investment. In other words, we do not have enough money from surpluses to invest in our capital plan to meet all of the needs that are identified over the 20-year capital assessment plan. So, what can we do? To improve the fiscal outlook, this would require taking steps to increase revenues or reduce expenditures, or both. Tax increases would have a limited effect because 80% of our budget in fact comes from federal transfers. Very large increases would therefore be necessary to generate a meaningful impact on our revenues. Borrowing certainly may seem a tempting way to avoid any reductions, but it is not a sustainable option, not for capital and much less for operating purposes. We have funded capital for many years using partial debt financing and continue to do so. But as a result, our debt has become elevated and continuing indefinite debt accumulation is obviously not a viable path. So I'll pause here. If there's any questions on this section of the presentation, I'm happy to take them at this point now, or we can certainly take any feedback you might have. The next slide will show you a number of questions that we're asking you to think about. The questions that we have are available on the survey, and I would ask you to consider taking the survey that's available on the finance website. I'm not sure if we have any questions or if we want to hit the. We do have some. Questions coming in, and on the next slide you will see some questions that we have for you to think about. So, first question: wasn't the borrowing limit increased? Can't we borrow more to support the capital plan? So yes, the borrowing limit was recently increased. The federal government did grant us an increase, but that said, What we're projecting now is that we're still likely, well, there's still a reasonable chance that within the life of this assembly, that we may well wind up still hitting what is the increased borrowing limit if we were to continue to rely on funding or rely on borrowing and debt in order to fund the capital plans. So yes, we can borrow more to support the capital plan, but that comes at that at some point we will simply not be able to continue to do so, and it's not a long-term best effort in terms of how to manage our fiscal resources. I guess one more comment on that, I'll wait and pause for a second if there's any more questions coming in on this one or any comments on the questions that we have to think about. We also want to keep in mind that if we run the debt up, it leaves less and less room for future governments or for future situations that might arise. So, for example, COVID-19 was unexpected, certainly did cause a rise in our expenses and a reduction in our revenues. It's not difficult to imagine that you want to ensure that you always have a bit of room in your fiscal plan to deal with these kinds of situations. Let's see. Okay. If there's nothing else coming in on this section, we certainly can move on. So section 2 of the presentation is about revenue, revenue generation and own source revenues in particular. One way to improve our fiscal outlook is to increase our revenues. But how, of course, is the critical question. Now, as I mentioned, I think earlier, most of our budget, indeed 80% of our budget, is comprised of federal transfers over which the Gnwt has limited control. Taxes and fees are the areas over which we can exercise our control. But again, there are always trade-offs and things that we need to balance, such as competitiveness and the cost of living, which is already very high in the Northwest Territories. And you'll note here in the slide, there is a weak connection between the territorial economy and the Gnwt's revenues. That is because of the size and the nature of the fiscal arrangements that we get that we have arranged with the federal government. So I'll just unpack that a little bit. Our total revenues from the federal government grants, about 70% are from the Territorial Formula Financing, or TIF. Our small population and relatively small economy means that we simply do not have the ability to generate sufficient revenue on our own. As a result, the Gnwt gets fairly generous federal support in order to be able to provide programs and services at a comparative level to the provinces, at comparable levels of taxation. Another 10% of our revenue budget is from federal transfers, other federal transfers, notably the Canada Health Transfer. The Gnwt's own source revenues include personal and corporate income taxes, fuel, carbon, tobacco, and payroll taxes, fees and charges, and resource royalties. The Gnwt works to maintain a competitive tax regime to support the economy and encourage economic diversification and development. We try to keep our tax rates comparable to provinces so that tax burden is not a deterrent, causing individuals or businesses to relocate away from the Northwest Territories. So, some ways to increase tax revenue. There's two main areas here, broadly speaking. One is to grow the tax base through economic growth, and two is to increase taxes. By growing the tax base, you have more jobs, meaning more payroll taxes, or greater personal income, meaning higher income tax returns, more business activity, meaning more business tax revenue. It's the same tax rate on a larger base, which will generate the additional revenue. Or you can increase taxes. This is by raising the rates or raising user fees, by introducing new taxes or new fees, or some combination. So here, there's no need to increase the number of payers, but we would simply be asking that some or more of these groups have to pay more. I will go into a bit more about each of these options on the next couple of slides. Starting with increasing revenue through economic growth. Here's how growth in the Northwest Territories economy and population could result in higher revenues. Growth in the Northwest Territories economy and population results in higher revenues because of a growth across all the tax bases. Now again though, because own source revenues are such a small amount of overall revenues, even significant economic growth might still only amount to a fairly small growth in tax revenue. The biggest increase in revenues through economic growth would come from what is hopefully an associated growth in population. Each new resident represents approximately $39,000 in additional territorial formula financing grants from the federal government. Growth in tax revenues is limited by two facts. Or rather, growth in tax revenues, is limited by the two facts. One here is leakages. And what that means is increased economic activity in the Northwest Territories can leak out, such as by importing goods from other parts of Canada and therefore paying the money to those other locations, or from non-resident labor, resulting in the residents from elsewhere paying their taxes in different jurisdictions. And two is from the potential for clawbacks from the federal transfers. The Territorial Formula Financing Grant is designed to make up for our lower ability to generate own source revenues. So if in fact we start to increase our own source revenues, those replacement transfers go down. So increasing revenues through tax increases. A few facts now about the GNWT's tax system. The GNWT would keep 100% of tax rate increases or new taxes because the Territorial Formula Financing process does not seek to penalize a tax effort. On the contrary, the idea is to have an incentive to in fact grow our own source revenue. A sales tax is the biggest sources of revenue in the provinces, other than Alberta, where they don't have a sales tax. If the GNWT wanted a significant new tax revenue, then note that a 2% harmonized sales tax would raise approximately $20 million. But that 2% sales tax would also raise overall Northwest Territories prices by approximately 1.4%. The GNWT's tax rates currently, other than tobacco and liquor markups, are near or below the national average. Tobacco and liquor markup taxes, by comparison, are the highest in Canada. Personal income tax, which is approximately 5% of our total revenues, is a progressive income tax structure, meaning that as one's personal income increases, the tax burden increases. And that is done by applying a higher tax rate to a higher level of income or to a higher tax bracket. The corporate income tax rate, which results in approximately 1% of our total revenues, is quite close to the national average. Resource revenues could also be increased, but here again, the fiscal impacts would be minimal, and noting that the net resource revenues are less than 1% of our total revenue, and there is already a fairly high cost for remote exploration and mine development. Adding additional cost on this sector may well discourage any new exploration or mines and could possibly reduce the life of existing mines by reducing their profitability. And so for this second section now, some questions to think about, again, coming out from the survey. And at this point, I certainly would invite anyone who has any questions about own source revenues, revenue generation, ideas on taxation or not taxation. This is certainly your opportunity, or if you have any ideas or want to comment on the questions that are on this slide, please feel free to do so. If we have any questions on this one. So one question, is the GNWT planning to increase taxes? So there certainly isn't a plan underway right now, but that really is the goal and the point of doing some of these dialogues, is to get a sense of what the public perception and what the public response would be to the situation that we're in, acknowledging that there does need to be some consideration given to the long-term fiscal situation that the GNWT finds itself in, and ways that we might look at increasing our revenue, whether that's through taxation or whether we try to focus on economic growth. So again, simple answer no, but the bigger answer is that we're looking forward to hearing what other people's reactions to these different. How much did the NWT get for the COVID transfers? I'm pretty sure I kept that little scrap of paper here somewhere. Off the top of my head, I think there was just over 23 million initially in the first wave, which was really directed at the healthcare expenses and costs. We've also received some support for our airline sector specifically, and there is currently the restart agreement that's been negotiated with all of the provinces and territories, which there's still more coming up. Oh, and one more I forgot about. Just under $5 million for the wage top-up has been put through to Northwest Territories, through their businesses and residents, employees here. So And again, the restart agreement is currently underway, and I'm expecting that that will be settled fairly soon. That's being offered to all provinces and territories, and a specific northern component to that as well. So, okay. And then, oh, and I think there's one more coming in. Yes. How does the GNWT plan to increase economic growth? I mean, that really is the million-dollar question. Well, hopefully more than a million-dollar question. You know, and that's, again, part of the reason we want to do this dialogues is to have a sense of people's ideas. The mineral resource sector, as you're going to see actually in the next part of the section or the next part of the presentation, remains the most significant and largest area of the economy, second only to public administration. But as far as economic diversification, if that's the direction of this question, tourism certainly was a bright light for a long time and is certainly going to be under a lot of pressure as a result of what's happening nationally and internationally with COVID-19. So that may well be a factor out of our control. There are certainly a lot of other opportunities in areas where we might see some growth, where we have some chance to take some steps. You know, certainly there's movement in terms of a knowledge economy, in terms of educational components, in terms of what might happen by putting ourselves out and making ourselves as real leaders in a lot of areas that make us unique. You know, beyond that, I think there's also a lot of opportunity in terms of how we structure our relationships with some of the Indigenous governments here in the Northwest Territories. So a lot of different ideas, and some of them have been talked about in some of these other sessions. So if you do have some thoughts or ideas, I'm certainly happy to have them shared in the course of this forum or also in the survey. One more, does decreasing taxes actually encourage economic growth? I feel like I should maybe go back to Economics 101 and see if I do a better job of answering this question, but I don't think it's quite such a simple answer as saying yes, no, necessarily. But the idea certainly is that if you increase your taxes too much, you may well be discouraging economic growth. And the reason for that being that the ability to invest capital in business is reduced if you don't have as much money to invest because you're paying higher taxes. The ability of starting a business may be reduced if you have less income because, again, you've been paying higher taxes. And if we're trying to increase our labor pool, well, if people are paying higher taxes, they may be less inclined to stay in the Northwest Territories, which is reducing our local labor pool. So those are some reasons why it might discourage. So that, again, that's the kind of balance and trade-off we want to keep in mind and consider when we are going down a path of determining whether we increase our revenues through economic growth or whether we increase our revenues through taxation or some balancing between the two. Another question, when can we expect the Polytechnic to open in Yellowknife? Credible post-secondary institution would be an economic driver in our capital city while providing meaningful options for our children who don't want to leave home or adults who want to further their skills but are unable to relocate. You know, I think we've done, on top of the media session, we've now done 3 of these public dialogues and had some questions come back in on the survey. And I think I can safely say that the Polytechnic and the idea of academic changes and post-secondary changes has come up every time. So I certainly appreciate hearing that in that it starts to, you know, as we start to build on themes, that is actually really helpful. That's exactly the kind of thing that we want to have happen in the course of these dialogues. I don't have the answers to the exact specifics on when the Polytechnic can open. You know, one of the other things we're doing is that the government doesn't operate in a bubble, and it can't. So although the dialogues here are being run through the Department of Finance and for the purposes of looking at economics and economic drivers, all of my colleagues on cabinet are going to be engaged and learning what we get here back on our feedback. So I mean, if you want a specific answer, you know, pass your contact information on to Todd. I think his email will be along somewhere in the chat screen, and we'll certainly make sure that you get that specific information through EC&E. And then beyond that, you know, I had touched on the idea of the knowledge economy, which is an ITI initiative, but one that also feeds in and relates back to EC&E and the connection between that post-secondary institution as an economic driver. In addition to the fact that, as you, I think, note here, there's a lot to be said for labor shortages and labor impacts, which actually is the next and last part of the presentation. But before we get to that, we have one more question here. Is there any way to tax fly-in, fly-out workers more than resident workers? Now, well, so, I mean, first of all, there certainly is a payroll tax that is levied on all employers, or all employees rather. So although the fly-out workers don't pay their full income taxes in the Northwest Territories, they do pay a payroll tax. So there is some amount that is received back. But then beyond that, I mean, we have to maintain fairness between the individuals who are being taxed. So that's probably not going to be the singular answer. And again, keeping in mind that the taxation revenues that we receive from that is actually a fairly small part of what is the actual revenue income that comes into the Gnwt. Okay, I'm getting the signal that we might be wrapping up questions, and although I will say here, if you're not seeing your question put into the column, it may well be that there's some questions that sort of are similar. We do have a couple of moderators that I'm working with who are trying to get things in, sometimes shortening it if we need to, just to keep things flowing, and to try to avoid repeating questions if they've been heard once or more. But we do apologize if we do miss your question. It's certainly, it's still a human system over here. So sorry if we've missed your question. Please pay attention. Please continue to send them in. Or I do see that Todd has very graciously now added his email there, so you can certainly pepper him with your questions after the fact if you do want to have more. Still want to have some answers or some dialogue. Okay, so last section of the slide or of the presentation is this one is looking at a high level at the economy. I think I need a sip of water, sorry. And how our economy has impacts and influences on the Gnwt's budgeting. So as I think we've heard me saying, economic growth can lead to higher own source revenues by expanding tax bases, but the control that we have over our territorial economy as a whole is limited. That said, we certainly have a role and we have levers that we can pull. So starting out here with the labor force, the small Northwest Territories labor force does constrain our economic growth. The resident labor force is assumed to be steady over the medium term, sitting at approximately 23,000 people. And of that 23,000 people, 21,000 are employed. However, our total employment in terms of employment available is in fact over 26,000 positions. And the difference, some 5,000, is filled by non-resident workers. As I've said already, those workers from outside of the territory do not pay income tax in the Northwest Territory, although, as I just noted in response, they do pay a payroll tax. Some parts of the economy, I would keep in mind, do depend on these workers, and they simply could not operate without them. Okay. The Northwest Territories economy, as I think I said earlier, continues to be dominated by government or public administration and mining. These are the two largest sectors in the territorial economy. Its resource extraction is again, and public administration. And the jobs mix is in fact most heavily skewed to public administration, 7,200 jobs. This is by far the largest employer in the Northwest Territories. Now keep in mind, public administration does not simply mean the GNWT. This includes all levels of government, from Indigenous governments to community governments, and the federal government as well. Public administration and mining jobs are also some of the highest paying. And the good news is both of these sectors have strong linkages to other sectors, such as construction, transportation, and the service industry. What that means is that they have strong effects elsewhere in the economy, so that the dollars that are being earned by individuals in public administration or mining then continue to circulate in these other areas of our economy. It's also worth keeping in mind that the sheer large size of government makes it a major force in the economy. And so this is again where the actions, policies that we take in government certainly can have impacts on society, on labor, and as a result on the economy as a whole. The next couple of slides will go into looking at what we can and cannot control. We are going to start with what we cannot control. Having acknowledged the major role of public administration as a whole in the economy, including in particular that of the Gnwt, Let's turn, as I said, first to the things we can't control. Number one is global demand for non-renewable resources. The development of a resource base is going to be dependent on world prices, as well as on the health of national and global financial systems, other countries' policies, and factors entirely outside of our control or prediction, such as COVID-19. We also have limited control over international tourism. So as I'd mentioned earlier, although this was certainly and continues to be an area of much interest for economic diversification, we have to keep in mind, certainly in the short term, that international travel has collapsed in light of health concerns and travel restrictions that exist around the world. And quite simply, no amount of international marketing will change some of those current realities, certainly not in the short term. It is not known and can't really be known when that situation will significantly change. And our third item under this category is population. The Northwest Territories continues to have a small population and, as a result, a small labor force and small tax base. And certainly over the last many years, efforts have been made to increase the population, and yet our population remains relatively stable. But better news, what can we control? Government is again a fairly major player. We have important levers that we can pull. Some actions have direct impacts on people and businesses, and others have indirect but significant influence by providing, for example, a supportive atmosphere so that people and businesses can make effective or productive choices to invest in themselves and in their businesses. A few examples here of things that we as a government can control. Fiscal infrastructure. So again, this is including roads and airports, as well as libraries, health centers, and housing. Programs and services, such as education, childcare, elder care, and various economic stimulus incentives and programs. Public utilities like electricity and water, regulation, including environmental and consumer protection regulation and business regulation, and last is taxation. Again, as you've likely heard me say by now a few times, we want to ensure that our taxation system creates the right conditions for growth while still generating revenue and remaining equitable. So that is the end of the last section, looking at the economy as a large, looking at the kinds of things that the GNWT has direct influence on, indirect influence on, some control, less control. And we're finishing off with some of the final questions to think about, again, coming from the survey, and some things that we would be pleased to get your feedback on, or again, if there's any general questions that are out there, about, again, economy as a whole, or anything about the presentation as a whole. All right. Okay, well, first question we have, has the GNWT considered altering the Territorial Nominee program, which is an immigration program, to improve economic growth? You know, I'll just start by saying, again, that the idea of having an impact on our immigration policy and what we might do to influence immigration policy now has again come up as a consistent theme, I think, on all of our presentations that we've done so far. There are two policies on immigration within the GNWT. There is both the ITI and the EC&E policy, and you know, as far as I'm aware at the present time, neither of which are under obvious or immediate review. Now, again, that said, if you have a very specific question about one of those two, or you wanted to be able to engage directly with those departments, please do drop us a line, and we'll make sure that those questions get directed into the departments specifically for a more detailed answer. But as far as broadly speaking, you know, yeah, $39,000 sort of per person is significant, and likely is something that, you know, given that this has been feedback a few times over, we may well have to look at whether or not we are doing everything we can as a government to continue to seek population growth. And it may be an opportunity to look back at what has been attempted and hasn't worked over the last few years. Do you include the internet in public utilities? Well, you know, I think those are just, you know, I'm not going to get, where would I put the internet? Is it a public utility? Is it infrastructure? You know, let's say, though, that I do think that the government has a significant role to play in terms of trying to support the continued expansion of access to high-speed internet. And we're not a service provider, so the government isn't necessarily going to come to your house and actually wire up your house and provide you the kind of service that Bell or Northwestel or TELUS might provide, or any one of the other newer, younger service providers that are out there in the Northwest Territories. But there are a number of functions that the government does play, and a number of roles that the government does play with respect to internet and to broadband, which, having mentioned earlier, the challenges created by COVID, this is an area where COVID has also made it very clear and significant the impact and the importance of having access to good broadband. So that is definitely an area where the government has a role, whether in terms of providing that infrastructure, whether in terms of providing some advocacy, whether in terms of providing support. And the advocacy and the support go vis-a-vis the CRTC. So we are regulated, we are significantly regulated up here by CRTC in terms of what kinds of changes there can be. And that's, again, GNWT still has a role there to play in terms of being a voice and being a significant voice at federal tables, so that we can continue to have that growth. If it wasn't obvious before, I would say it certainly is, again, going to be obvious now. Okay, another one. Do you think that the size of government, particularly the size of GNWT, is a drag on economic growth and diversification? That's another one of the themes we are hearing, is about a concern about, is the public service too big? Can we reduce the size of the public service? Would that, result in a savings of expenditures, which obviously you're saving money on the one side, you have more revenue or money to direct elsewhere. Keep in mind, of course, we have 33 communities spread over a very large expanse of territory. So in order to deliver equitable levels of programs and services across the entire GNWT and across all of those communities will no doubt require a fairly significant sized public service. And I had looked up, out of curiosity, just what's happening in some of the other territories. And all three territories are actually fairly similar. Us on the Yukon in particular are fairly similar in terms of the size of our public administration. Nunavut actually has a higher percentage of individuals employed in public administration than either us or our neighbors in the Yukon. So this is not an area that we're expecting to see significant savings or significant change. Is income testing a fair way to raise revenue for expensive programs such as health? And this is, I'm pausing only because there's so many different programs and some of them have so many different costs associated. But health, as an example, is one where there are things that are expensive, but there's also, if you have a healthy population and you have a healthy indicators for your population, that's probably a really good way to ensure that people are able to join the labor force. And if you have good access to solid programs and services, again, you're likely to attract people, recruit them, and retain them to stay in the Northwest Territories. So we certainly want to be conscious of remaining competitive in the kinds of costs that it takes to deliver our programs and services and to access programs and services in terms of that bigger picture of whether we want to increase economic growth with labor forces and with idea generation, or whether we want to have a tax base available. So, so is it a way to increase revenue? Yes. Is it a fair way? Well, you are going to be winding up treating people differently. And again, there's some trade-offs, pretty significant trade-offs and balances to consider taking that approach. Oh, I'm getting behind. There's a whole bunch of questions in queue. Okay. Have we thought about introducing a year-round school year? With all of the changes that have come about as a result of COVID, are we looking at reshaping the education system so that we can get more efficiency for the dollar spent? Oh gosh, I think Minister Simpson's ears must be burning. This is definitely a question for EC&E. I can say that I don't think there's been any murmurings, at least at the present time, about a year-round school year. I think the focus has certainly been across departments and across government to ensuring that students can go back to school this September in as normal a way as possible. And get back into some routine for children and youth who certainly went through some significant changes in the last few months. So that's been the, I think, overall all hands on deck focus for the last while. But again, COVID has certainly done brought about a lot of changes. I would say probably one of the biggest ones that's impacting not only education but also health and the delivery of other programs and services is the ability to access services and programs remotely, using broadband, using alternative technologies, and balancing that with the importance of building relationships in person, but also having different kinds of access that might in fact reduce the costs of other means, and potentially provide better access to some of those services. So is the Gnwt exploring the option of a universal basic income? There have been there's so much out in the media right now. I do spend a lot of my leisure hours reading policy papers and various analysis in the news, because that's how I spend my evenings, having fun. And there's a lot right now out there, not only about universal basic income, but also about guaranteed basic income, which are not the same. And in the past, I think there's been some research done on these opportunities and options. And I think, again, this is Minister Simpson's, we're gonna have to see what he can do with his northern distance learning opportunities, and so he could perhaps deliver his own session like this, because this is a question for income for EC&E again, where that would come under their area. And I do think that again, if you're in this role and as a government, you have to be alive to some of these ideas and options to continue to improve and access our programs and services. So I know I'm not entirely answering your question, but mainly because it's not entirely mine to answer, other than to say that we are certainly alive and hearing the calls to start considering some different ways of delivering income assistance. You talked about four-year business plans in the budget speech. Yes, I did. How do you think this will improve government programs and services? Oh, I'm so happy somebody asked. So the planning cycle right now, or as it has been, typically is a one-year process. 1 year, like year over year, every year, you get a one-year plan. You get a budget. You get a one-year plan from sort of September to September, and there's a fairly set cycle of all the steps that are going in the financial planning that happens within the GNWT, whether it's sort of your business planning and then your capital planning, and then you're getting ready for your main estimate operations budget. You do your operations budget, and then you start again with your business planning, getting ready for the fall again. So it never really ends, and it just sort of keeps going, in this 12-month cycle. But by moving into a four-year business plan, it really forces getting work that's already happening, but forces getting those plans to look more long term. So, because sometimes the thing that a department is looking to accomplish, whether it's a review, whether it's a new program or service, having a four-year business plan gives a better opportunity to really look at how you will, for something that requires more than a 12-month cycle, or where that 6-month period may not fall perfectly within the 12 months, it really gives a better opportunity to create planning. And if we're doing a better job of planning, then I don't think it's a far stretch to say that we're probably going to be doing a more efficient job in terms of using our resources as well and delivering those programs. Okay. What about increased childcare? With the school situation uncertain for the fall, many people will be forced to stay home to care for their kids instead of going to work. So, first option is hopefully that the situation at schools is becoming less uncertain. I know there's been quite a number of announcements put out by EC&E and in conjunction with Chief Public Health Officer, and that they have spent a significant amount of time working between Health and Social Services, EC&E, and then engaged with the district education authorities, who are ultimately responsible for the school-by-school plans that are being developed and delivered. So, again, first choice really is to have children return to a semblance of normal for them, which certainly impacts the availability of the labor force to not be at home caring for children. That said, there have been a number of measures that were introduced as part of our response to COVID-19 to try to help out individuals who had to remain at home to care for children who were suddenly not at school, with very few other options, particularly kids outside of that of a younger daycare age bracket. So, this certainly, I don't think it's going too far to say that what happened with COVID-19 has impacted our awareness, everyone's awareness of the importance of childcare as part of an economic picture, that if people don't have childcare, you're taking folks out of the workforce and you're disrupting what's happening in businesses in the private sector as well as in the government sector. So, it's already in our mandate to increase and improve upon access and availability of childcare. And that mandate item hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, and the realities and the impacts are as pressing as ever. How's the government doing at program evaluation? Interestingly enough, this was something that came up quite a lot for me actually during the campaign as I was speaking to people of, how do we do things better? It's not that you necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you need to make sure that you're delivering the right wheel, putting on the right car. So how are we doing at program evaluation? I'm happy to say that the Department of Finance has doubled the program that we run within the Department of Finance around program evaluation, looking to have that fully staffed by the fall, by September. And to really turn it into something that can then support all of the departments, so that when a department comes forward to the Financial Management Board with a program seeking funding for an initiative, often it comes with an expectation that they would deliver on, what will the outcomes of that program be? What can you say to us about what your outputs are going to be? Are you actually going to achieve the goal that you've set out for yourself? And by increasing our ability to deliver on that kind of evaluation, we're increasing the ability across departments to actually be more effective in achieving the goals. So, I think we're making some significant changes. And I'm hopeful that we can, and frankly, you wouldn't be doing a good job of evaluating if you can't evaluate the evaluators. So I'm hopeful by the time we're doing the next budget speech that we'll be able to report positively on some improvements in that area. See if there's anything else. Okay. Just a quick note, we certainly are, as you, I hope, are realizing, and it may have been noted here, we are recording all of the comments that come in, not only the ones that you may be seeing on the screen, but anything that comes in does get recorded, does get saved, and it will certainly be part of the What We Heard report that gets produced. And for anyone wondering, as I think has been asked a couple of times, well, what do you do with the What You Heard report? I think I kind of went this way earlier, alluded to this earlier. This is a document that has some good timing. It's coming in at the end of August, which is right before we go into capital plan reviews with the whole of the Legislative Assembly, and also as we're going into the business plan reviews. So, as you, I think, just heard me said a little earlier, there's this constant cycle that goes around all 12 months that there's always something that's happening. There's always an element of planning that's going on. In some ways, there's not a perfect opportunity to jump in and say, when do you use this kind of feedback? But I think in some ways, coming in this fall, where we have draft capital plans and some draft business plans, but those final reviews are going to be happening this fall. So having this report at that particular moment in time will be particularly useful, I think, for all departments to look at and to rely upon, and for all of the whole of government to then look at and rely upon and make sure that we are in fact continuing to deliver in the direction that that the public wants us to while achieving the mandate. All right. What else have we got here? Oh yes, and don't forget to complete the survey. How prepared is the Gnwt to financially support residents and businesses if there is a large outbreak here? Okay. We were able to scramble the first time around, and I don't want to say that word, without a note of caution, that when COVID-19 sort of emerged on the world stage, and there was a couple of months where people were sort of seeing it coming, and there was some understanding of that there was a pandemic beginning. Although I think even people were slow to use that word. There was a bit of a scramble, and yet we were able to deliver on some fairly quick turnarounds and some fairly quick outputs as far as changing fees, reducing fees, changing timelines, sort of the soft side of providing relief in terms of sort of saying, well, you don't worry about paying money, don't worry about paying the government's taxes or fees, etc. Well, we can sort of change all of that. As far as then turning around and offering that support, certainly the federal government has had the lion's share of crafting and outputting significant dollars. But and I have to say, I don't think if we continue to have to support residents and businesses, then we'll continue to have to support residents and businesses. So has the response been necessarily perfect? Well, perhaps not. I'm sure there's always more need. It has been a pandemic, and for some folks, it's been no doubt significant personal tragedy or business tragedy. But there's been a lot of efforts made to date, and those efforts, if there's a lag sometimes in announcing things, it's not because work's not happening. It's not because people aren't evaluating what more can be done. It's often that we're now trying to catch up and actually do some of that evaluation and make sure that with the resources that we have, that we are directing them in a way that will provide the greatest benefit to as many people as possible. And that won't change. And if there's a large outbreak, that won't change. And if we have to retool the fiscal plan again and retool some of the projections that you saw again, well, then that's what we'll have to do. Let's see. Any other questions coming in? Okay, I'm not seeing anything else coming in. We're rounding up at a nice even 1 hour mark. Yeah, a couple seconds if there's anything further. If you think of something late, as I think Todd's email is further above there in the comments section, please, he's always happy to receive your emails and direct them, whether it's into the What We Heard or whether it's into the Department of Finance, or direct it to one of the other departments if there's some specific questions about their programs and services. And yeah, please do fill out that survey. There's lots of those little comment boxes. It's not a yes or no, and it's not just a multiple choice. So there's lots of comment boxes where you can explain, why you're saying what you're saying. I think you've heard me say a few times, there's been some themes emerging. One of the ones that I certainly hadn't expected to hear as much as around immigration, and that a real interest in looking again at what we need to do to recruit and retrain folks in the Northwest Territories. So, yeah, there's a few things. There's a few things that are emerging and lots of good ideas. And I think with that, we will let everyone go. So folks are in time to see the Whalers exhibition hockey game if they are so inclined, or to still go outside and catch some of a beautiful night. So thank you very much for joining us. Good night.